Let me be extremely direct with you right now. There is a corporate hierarchy operating inside professional sports that the average fan never sees, never studies, and frankly, never even thinks to question. It runs silently underneath every roster decision, every broadcasting deal, every contract negotiation, and every boardroom conversation happening behind closed doors in this league right now. Most people watching the WNBA from the outside genuinely believe that these athletes exist inside a sealed, self-contained ecosystem. They assume the players are permanently bound to the boundaries of their own league. They assume that corporate power only moves in one direction, that the rules are fixed, and that everything operates the way the morning show anchors describe it. That assumption is dangerously incorrect. The absolute elite operators in professional sports, the ones who actually move markets, shift valuations, and reshape entire business structures, do not acknowledge artificial boundaries. They do not request permission to cross corporate lines. They identify the leverage available to them, they calculate the maximum possible return on that leverage, and then they execute without hesitation and without apology. That is precisely what Caitlin Clark just did. Welcome back to Courtside Leaks. We do not manufacture narratives here. We do not soften uncomfortable financial realities to protect anyone's feelings or franchise relationships. What we do every single time is sit down with the cold mathematics of the sports business and walk through what is actually happening, not what the press releases say, not what the talking heads on morning television want you to believe, but what the numbers and the contracts and the corporate positioning actually reveal. So lock in right now. Turn off your notifications, because while the Indiana Fever front office is quietly managing one of the most complicated roster situations in WNBA history, the franchise's most valuable asset just executed a business maneuver so sophisticated that most analysts are still struggling to fully process what they witnessed. Let us walk through it together. The WNBA regular season has not even tipped off yet. Free agency is still in flux, the expansion draft is still being finalized, the collective bargaining negotiation between the league and its players is still unresolved. By all conventional logic, this should be the quietest, most uncertain stretch of the professional calendar for every player in this league. Caitlin Clark is not participating in the conventional logic. Clark has joined the NBC Sports team as a special contributor for Basketball Night in America, the pregame show that runs before Sunday Night Basketball. And before you dismiss that as a routine media appearance, before you file it away as just another athlete doing a television spot, I need you to stop and understand exactly what this arrangement actually represents at the corporate level. NBC Sports executive producer Sam Flood described Clark as one of the most captivating players and dynamic scorers in basketball. That statement was not made about her WNBA production. It was not a league-specific compliment. It was a global, sport-wide declaration of market positioning. Sam Flood does not use that kind of language in a press release without understanding exactly what he is communicating to the industry. After her debut on February 1st, Clark returned for a second appearance on March 29th in Oklahoma City when the Thunder hosted the New York Knicks. This is not a one-time experiment. This is a structured, multi-appearance broadcasting arrangement with the most prestigious NBA package currently on American television. Now I need you to process the financial and brand architecture of what she just constructed. She is not appearing on a WNBA broadcast. She is actively and deliberately inserting herself into the gravitational orbit of the NBA, the highest revenue professional basketball league on the planet. She is borrowing the audience, the prestige, the advertising infrastructure, and the cultural authority of the NBA and redirecting a significant portion of that energy directly toward her own personal brand valuation. NBC Sports executive producer Sam Flood told the Associated Press there is no more iconic figure in basketball right now in the women's game or the sport in general, and that they wanted to have a bigger conversation. That last phrase is the most important one, a bigger conversation, not a bigger audience, not a ratings bump, a bigger conversation. What Flood is acknowledging publicly is that Clark's economic footprint has already exceeded the domestic boundaries of the WNBA. The network is not bringing her in because she is a great women's basketball player. They are bringing her in because she is a crossover commercial force with the rare ability to draw an audience that does not already watch what you are broadcasting. That is the definition of market expansion. That is what billionaires pay for. And she negotiated it for herself before her second WNBA season has even begun. During her broadcast debut, Clark commented that this moment is not just significant for the WNBA. She described it as one of the biggest moments women's sports has ever had. That is not modesty. That is accurate market analysis from someone who understands exactly what she is building and exactly where she sits in the broader sports economy right now.
Let me contrast this with something that reveals the internal structure of the Indiana Fever organization. While Caitlin Clark is sitting at the primary desk on NBC Sports analyzing NBA playoff contenders, Fever head coach Stephanie White was traveling to call early-round NCAA tournament games. A completely respectable and legitimate assignment, but let us be intellectually honest about what that contrast communicates about where different people in this organization currently operate in the media economy. The head coach is building her broadcasting resume in the college market. The franchise cornerstone is building her brand on the biggest professional basketball platform in the country. That is not a criticism. That is simply an accurate description of the asymmetry of influence that now exists inside the Indiana Fever franchise, an asymmetry that becomes extremely relevant when you examine what the front office is now being forced to navigate on the roster side of this business. Here is where the story gets genuinely complicated, and here is where the casual fan base is going to have the most emotionally difficult time separating their feelings from the financial reality. The Toronto Tempo and the Portland Fire are both entering the WNBA in 2026. The first major order of business after CBA ratification is scheduling the expansion drafts for both franchises. With 2 expansion teams instead of 1, the belief is that all 13 existing WNBA teams will only be able to protect 5 players, compared to 6 when the Golden State Valkyries entered the league. 5 protection slots, that is all Indiana gets, and they have one of the deepest, most complicated roster situations in the entire league. The expansion drafts will allow the 2 newest franchises to build their initial rosters ahead of free agency and the 2026 season. The Tempo and the Fire will also reportedly be allowed to select 1 unrestricted free agent, which makes the expansion draft significantly riskier for established WNBA teams. Now let us do the math slowly and deliberately, because this is where general managers earn their salaries. The first 4 protection decisions for Indiana are not remotely controversial. Caitlin Clark is protected without a second of discussion. She is the commercial engine of this franchise, of this market, and frankly of this league in its current financial form. Aaliyah Boston is protected. She is the interior defensive anchor who gives the roster its structural backbone. Kelsey Mitchell is protected through the core designation available under the CBA framework. Lexi Hull will be protected as a restricted free agent, meaning Indiana retains the right to match any outside offer she receives, making her protection both contractually sensible and financially essential. That is 4, which means every single roster debate in Indiana right now comes down to one question: who gets the 5th and final protection slot? ESPN analyst Kevin Pelton predicted that Indiana would protect 2025 rookie Makala Timpson over Cunningham, as she appears to have a longer upside runway, though Cunningham is by far the bigger star at this moment. Cunningham's first season with Indiana was cut short by injury, but her leadership remained highly visible. She was regularly seen offering guidance from the bench and helping Caitlin Clark and the team navigate their playoff run. And she is beloved. That part is not manufactured. The fan base in Indiana has a deeply genuine emotional connection to Sophie Cunningham. She earned it through effort, through personality, through her willingness to physically protect the franchise star, and through a media presence that proved she could hold her own in any room she entered. According to search data, Cunningham was the 7th most searched athlete of 2025, beating out her own star teammate in annual search volume. That is a remarkable commercial achievement for a rotational wing player in her first season with a new organization. But here is where the business overrides the emotion completely. Cunningham is entering this offseason as an unrestricted free agent. Since the Fever also cannot core her, they will almost certainly use their single core designation on Kelsey Mitchell. They have no contractual mechanism to lock her in regardless of what happens in the expansion draft. That single sentence changes the entire calculus of this decision. Think about what it means to use a protection slot on a player you cannot legally control. If Indiana burns their 5th and final protection pick on Sophie Cunningham, and she then walks away in free agency the following morning to sign a larger contract with a rival franchise, what exactly did that protection accomplish? Nothing. Less than nothing, because now they have left Makla Timpson exposed to Portland and Toronto, and one of those expansion franchises will scoop her up without hesitation. Protecting Timpson makes mathematical sense because a rookie-scale contract is an incredibly controlled and cost-efficient financial instrument. If Indiana leaves Timpson unprotected, an expansion team will select her immediately, and Indiana loses a highly controllable young asset for absolutely no return. You protect the assets you legally control. You do not protect the assets you have no contractual claim to. That is not callousness. That is the fundamental operating principle of every front office in professional sports, and the Indiana Fever's general management would be committing genuine financial malpractice if they deviated from it. But the strategic architecture here goes even deeper than the protection decision itself. There is a critically important expansion draft rule embedded in the new CBA. If either Portland or Toronto selects an unrestricted free agent in the expansion draft, they are legally mandated to offer that player the veteran Supermax contract. That single clause is doing enormous hidden work in this situation. The veteran Supermax contract in the WNBA's new CBA structure is locked in at approximately $1.4 million. Think about what that number represents as a percentage of a newly expanded franchise's total salary budget. These expansion teams are entering the league with genuine financial ambitions, but they are also entering with the cold arithmetic responsibilities of new business owners. Every dollar they commit to one player is a dollar they cannot deploy somewhere else on a roster they are still constructing from scratch. Sophie Cunningham is a genuinely excellent professional basketball player. She is a highly efficient perimeter shooter. She creates spacing for the players around her, she defends with energy and physicality, and she elevates the chemistry in any locker room she enters. Nobody rational disputes any of that. But is she a $1.4 million cornerstone for a franchise that has not yet played a single regular season game? Is she worth allocating roughly 20% of your entire newly expanded salary cap to before you have determined what your identity, your market position, or your long-term roster construction actually looks like? The expansion franchises will almost certainly decline to select her because the mandatory financial commitment is simply too steep relative to her market value at this stage of her career. The Indiana front office is not blindly gambling by leaving Cunningham exposed. They are executing a calculated high-stakes strategic play. They are making Portland and Toronto an offer they structurally cannot accept. Take Cunningham, but only if you're willing to pay her $1.4 million immediately. They are daring the expansion franchises to trigger a financial commitment that contradicts every principle of rational new franchise roster construction. It is, when you strip away all the emotional noise, a sophisticated corporate bluff backed by real contract mathematics. One analyst noted that even if an expansion team selected Cunningham, she could theoretically still leave for another team in free agency shortly after, potentially even returning to the Fever, which further complicates the calculus for Portland and Toronto. So the expansion teams are being asked to commit $1.4 million to a player who might not even stay with them after they select her. The logical response from any rational general manager is to look elsewhere. The trap works, at least on paper. But surviving the expansion draft is only the first chapter of this financial narrative. And the second chapter is where the Indiana Fever front office genuinely begins to sweat. Once the expansion draft concludes and the protection designations are finalized, the open market unlocks, and the open market in 2026 is unlike anything this league has ever seen before. The new collective bargaining agreement has dramatically restructured WNBA compensation at every level. The salary cap has expanded significantly, which means every franchise in this league now has more ammunition to deploy in free agency than ever before. The expansion franchises in particular are entering free agency flush with capital and desperate to build identity through marquee signings. They need stars. They need names. They need players who will draw cameras and ticket buyers and social media engagement. Sophie Cunningham checks every single one of those boxes. She is not just a basketball player anymore. She is a brand. She is a personality. She is a media presence. She proved last season that her commercial appeal could reach audiences well beyond the traditional WNBA fan base, and every rival general manager in this league watched that happen in real time. The realistic concern is that the Fever might be able to offer Cunningham somewhere around $600,000 in free agency, while a rival franchise with more cap flexibility or an expansion team building its roster with aggressive spending could jump to $900,000 or more. That is a $300,000 annual gap. In the context of the broader sports economy, $300,000 might sound manageable. In the context of WNBA salaries, which have historically been suppressed, that represents an enormous percentage difference in annual compensation. No rational professional athlete takes a $300,000 per year pay cut simply to preserve a locker room relationship. The era of loyalty discounts in professional sports is over. The new CBA was designed specifically to prevent players from being financially undervalued, and the players who negotiated it are not going to volunteer to undermine its purpose the moment free agency opens. Cunningham's commercial positioning heading into this offseason is genuinely exceptional. After aligning herself with Caitlin Clark and delivering visible, high-energy performances both on and off the court, she gave every competing executive in the league a clear picture of what she brings beyond the stat sheet. That visibility is now going to be used as leverage. The Indiana Fever front office is currently being squeezed from two directions simultaneously. If they lose Cunningham in free agency without adequately competing for her, they face a genuine public relations problem and potentially a significant chemistry disruption heading into a season that was supposed to represent a major step forward. If they panic and dramatically overpay to retain her, they compromise their financial flexibility for the rest of this roster cycle, and potentially limit their ability to add the supporting pieces that would actually maximize Caitlin Clark's competitive window. There is no clean answer here. There is only the least damaging available outcome, and the front office's job is to find it. Some analysts argue Indiana simply cannot afford to let Cunningham leave, pointing to her impact on locker room chemistry and her role as a mentor, not just as an on-court contributor but as a stabilizing presence around the franchise's young core. The counterargument, and it is a serious one, is that professional sports franchises are not built on sentiment. They are built on contract mathematics, cap management, and the ruthless prioritization of long-term competitive sustainability over short-term emotional continuity. The Indiana front office has to make this calculation in real time, with genuine financial consequences on both sides of the ledger, while simultaneously managing the most complex roster construction challenge in franchise history. And while all of that is happening, while the front office is sweating through every possible financial scenario and the fan base is anxiously refreshing every WNBA insider's social media feed, the person at the center of all of it is sitting comfortably in an Oklahoma City studio, breaking down NBA defensive schemes on national television. Caitlin Clark is not stressed about the expansion draft. She is not losing sleep over Sophie Cunningham's contract situation or the CBA negotiations or the rival franchises circling her supporting cast. She is operating on a completely different frequency, one that increasingly does not require the WNBA as an intermediary for her commercial success. During her NBC broadcast debut, Clark spoke about the WNBA's labor situation, calling it one of the biggest moments women's sports has ever seen and expressing genuine confidence that a deal would be reached. She is engaged in the league's institutional future. She wants the WNBA to succeed. But she is also demonstrating with every move she makes this offseason that her personal brand has already achieved a level of commercial independence that separates her from every other player in this league's history. NBC Sports executive producer Sam Flood made clear that there is no more iconic figure in basketball right now, in the women's game or across the sport as a whole. That statement is the entire story in one sentence. Not the most iconic figure in women's basketball, not the most iconic figure in the WNBA, the most iconic figure in basketball, full stop. When the executive producer of NBC Sports' flagship basketball package makes that statement publicly, he is communicating something precise to the advertising market, to the sponsorship community, to rival networks, and to anyone who negotiates media rights for a living. He is saying that Caitlin Clark's commercial value has crossed a threshold that makes traditional league boundaries commercially irrelevant. She does not need to be introduced as a WNBA player. She does not need the WNBA broadcast infrastructure to reach a mass audience. She is a gravitational force capable of pulling viewership toward whatever platform she appears on, regardless of what that platform is broadcasting. That is a type of commercial power that almost no athlete in any sport achieves in the first 2 years of their professional career. And it creates a genuinely fascinating structural tension inside the Indiana Fever organization. Because the more dominant Clark's individual brand becomes, the more she outgrows the traditional WNBA media cycle, the more she operates on a crossover commercial frequency that encompasses the NBA and the broader sports universe, the more pressure the Indiana front office is under to build a supporting roster worthy of her competitive window. Because here is the uncomfortable mathematical reality that every serious analyst has to acknowledge. If the Indiana Fever cannot retain their core supporting cast, if they cannot solve the Sophie Cunningham situation and manage the expansion draft fallout and navigate free agency with enough skill to preserve the locker room chemistry that made them a genuine playoff contender last season, the competitive product on the floor degrades. And a degraded competitive product is the one thing that actually threatens what Clark is building. Right now, she can afford to be unbothered. The broader commercial engine of her brand operates independently of Indiana's win-loss record, but the long-term compounding of her athletic legacy, the championship ambitions, the sustained competitive excellence, the narrative arc of a player who transformed a franchise that requires Indiana to actually build and maintain a winning team around her. The front office is not just managing a roster. They are managing the supporting infrastructure of one of the most valuable individual sports properties in America. And if they get this expansion draft and free agency cycle wrong, they are not just losing a few good players. They are potentially delaying the competitive timeline of a franchise that has a closing window to build something genuinely historic. Let me bring this all back to the core thesis, because I want to make sure the full architecture of what we just analyzed is absolutely clear before we close. Caitlin Clark just signed a structured multi-appearance contributor deal with NBC Sports, placing herself at the primary desk of the most prominent NBA pregame broadcast in the country. She did this before the WNBA season started during active CBA negotiations, while her own franchise is navigating one of the most complex roster construction challenges in league history. She did it alongside Naismith Hall of Famers. She did it on a platform that reaches an audience that dwarfs the current WNBA viewership base. That is not an off-season hobby. That is deliberate, sophisticated brand architecture executed at the highest possible level. Simultaneously, the Indiana Fever are being forced to make an impossible 5-slot protection decision that will almost certainly leave Sophie Cunningham, one of the most beloved and commercially visible players on their roster, exposed to the expansion draft. The mathematics of protecting an unrestricted free agent are simply too unfavorable to justify using a critical slot on a player they cannot contractually retain regardless. Cunningham was the 7th most searched athlete of 2025, demonstrating that her cultural and commercial appeal has reached a level that rival franchises will absolutely attempt to leverage in free agency. The poison pill embedded in the CBA, the mandatory Supermax trigger that kicks in if an expansion team selects an unrestricted free agent, should protect Indiana during the expansion draft itself. Portland and Toronto are not going to commit $1.4 million to a player who can walk out the door the next morning. But the open free agent market has no such protection mechanism. And the open free agent market in 2026, supercharged by a new CBA and 2 expansion franchises with deep pockets and desperate brand-building motivations, is going to be the most aggressive bidding environment in WNBA history. The Indiana Fever front office has to navigate that environment while simultaneously managing the expectations of an ascending franchise, a demanding fan base, and a franchise star who is operating at a commercial altitude that the entire organization is struggling to match. The weak will be left behind in this environment. That is not dramatic rhetoric, that is just an accurate description of how professional sports markets work when the financial stakes are genuinely elevated for the first time in a league's history. Welcome to the new WNBA economy. It is not forgiving, it does not reward sentiment, and it does not wait for anyone to catch up. I want to hear exactly where you stand on this. Will Portland or Toronto actually trigger the Supermax clause and select Cunningham in the expansion draft? Will the Indiana front office find a way to retain her in free agency, or will a rival franchise simply outbid them? And how does Caitlin Clark's continued crossover into NBA broadcasting change the commercial expectations for this franchise going forward? Drop your most analytically grounded take in the comments below. If this breakdown gave you the full picture that everyone else is missing, hit subscribe and share this with someone who still thinks the WNBA front office decisions are simple. They are not, and we are just getting started.